Good to be back here at Frostburg State University, FSU TV3 with the Interfaith Roundtable, our second program. Maybe you saw the first, maybe you didn't. I'm Mark Perman, Rabbi and Cantor of Bear Chaim Congregation in Cumberland, and very pleased to welcome my guest this afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching the show. Reverend Martha McGill serves as the rector of Emmanuel Episcopal Parish in Cumberland, and we wanted to get her perspective today on her work, her background, her faith tradition, and why it's important to her. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
So you were a practicing attorney before you decided to go into ministry.
Yes.
You changed careers, you said, in your 30s. What inspired you to make that jump from something practical to something more spiritual?
Well, I think that I changed because when I originally went into the law, I did it for a reason that wasn't a reason genuine to who I am. Howard Thurman, this great spiritual writer and prophet, has said that there's the sound of the genuine in each of us. And our work in life is really to find that sound of the genuine. So my father was an attorney, and I grew up an only child with mostly just my father after my mother died when I was 13. And so what was most important to me in my life was getting my father's approval and showing him how much I loved him. And we didn't talk about that in my family. So I thought that I would become a lawyer just like he was. He was a railroad lawyer. And I went into the law, and almost from the beginning, when I got to law school, I found that I was not enjoying it. And I pushed myself through it, passed the bar, practiced corporate law, and then I kind of thought to myself, this is kind of crazy how you do sometimes, well, if I just specialize in something in law, I might really love it. Maybe I'll change my mind. And so I went to New York University and got my master's in tax law. And
That's
so then,
exciting.
yeah, well,
Very spiritual.
Well, I know. So, and of course, I didn't really particularly like getting my master's in tax law, but I did it. I plowed through. I clerked for a judge at the U.S. Tax Court in Washington, D.C., and then I was just about to go into private practice, and so I was doing interviews, and my father had just died. My father died when he was 80. And I was 30, and so I was sitting at lunch at an interview, a tax boutique, a law firm that was a tax boutique at their interview.
What's a tax boutique?
It just means they specialize in tax law. So the whole practice was about taxes and taking cases to the Internal Revenue Service and things like that. So I was sitting at lunch, and I just thought to myself, I do not want to be here. And I realized that after my father died, all the feelings that I had about becoming a lawyer, being a lawyer, they kind of died with him. And I realized that that really wasn't the sound of the genuine within me. So what I did is around that time, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. And Jack was born about, the end of the year my father died. And I went to have him baptized because I had been baptized. I hadn't been going back to church. I had kind of stopped going to church when my mother died when I was 13. And I said, well, I'd like to have him baptized. So I went back, and it was an emotional experience for me. And as I kept going back, I would kind of go back to church occasionally. By that time, I had stopped practicing law, and I was trying to find where I was going next.
Were you already a church goer, or you were not involved as a member?
No. I had and that was one of the big issues, is that the person, the priest there said to me, were you a member of this church? And I said, well, no. And they said, well, you need to be a member to have your child baptized. And that was that seemed like a door was closing, but that person kind of relented and said, well, because you went to the Episcopal Church up the street, we can work something out with that. So I felt like I had a closed door for a little bit, but then Jack was baptized, and not long after that, I started having health problems, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me, and I didn't know what else to do. I felt like I was dying, and I had left law. I had this newborn child. My husband and I were happy. We had this family, but I was starting to feel like something was very wrong with me physically. So I went didn't know what else to do, but one summer Sunday morning, I went to church. Hadn't been since my son had been baptized. And the scripture for the day, the first scripture was from Deuteronomy. I put before you death and life, choose life.
Choose life.
And it was just like, it was right to me. And I felt like, maybe I should come back. Maybe I should start coming back. So I started going back. And I grew up Episcopalian. I started going back to this Episcopal church. And I started taking a Bible study. And then all of a sudden, I realized this is where I should be all along. So that's a little bit of a long story, but a lot of my friends who are still attorneys were really fascinated because many of them were not happy doing what they were doing, but they weren't kind of ready to do that. So.
But they weren't ready to find that truth within. They
yes,
sort
that
of
sounded the genuine. And so
was it a calling? Because a lot of us describe sort of a calling from God to go into a ministry, or Jesus in your case, or not from the telephone, but just a sense of, well, let's go from where you became more of an active congregant to where you started
I would call it a calling then. But I think it was more living into who I was really supposed to be. And you could say the calling I think is not just God saying this is what you're supposed to do, a directive. It's an invitation to go further into who you truly are. Right. I think that's what a calling is. And one of the things that I do here as part of my ethics class, but I really have a real passion for, is to work with younger people or people of any age that feel, I'm not really living into who I truly am, and I don't know how to ask the questions or how to inquire. And I so wish that I had had someone or some course or in my own college career where I could have done that, because I probably wouldn't have gone to law school if I had had
Make it clear to everyone that you do teach a class at Prosper. So you want to just, because we have some students or faculty
that's right.
or their parents. So just tell everybody about the class.
So I teach contemporary ethical problems, Philosophy 102. I have taught 101, Introduction to Philosophy. But as I've taught it over several years, I have a workbook that I'm designing that I'm hoping to publish actually, and use actually beyond the university, maybe in companies and things like that, for ethical discernment in your life. And so that's what we do. We talk about all the big ethical issues: abortion, euthanasia, death penalty, environmental issues. But we also do at the same time a personal inquiry about vocation. And even though in the first half of life you're trying on a lot of things, that's normal, it is important to kind of start having the vocabulary to say, well, what would be a vocation as opposed to just a job?
Right.
When
you teach some of those issues, is it more objective than you would work on it in the church? Is it more academic and down the line, or do you let it infuse some of your religious beliefs and practices into what you teach?
Well, so one of the people that has really influenced me, teachers lately, is Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest in New Mexico, but he started this Center for Action and Contemplation, and he's recovered the old mystical tradition of the church, which is in Judaism, it's in Islam, it's in Buddhism, it's in Christianity, and it actually has gone underground as the church from the Enlightenment on particularly focused on reason and the mind.
Right.
And so it's what I do in class is I try to bring in, I've just done a piece around how you find kind of your calling. And David Brooks, New York Times columnist, has written The Second Mountain, I believe, about the inquiry into vocation. And I've been using that, but I've been talking about how in every great tradition, there's this moment where you say, I need to be who I'm called to be, not what the world asks me to be. So there's Moses in the burning bush.
Yep.
There's Paul on the Damascus Road.
How about Jesus' moment?
Yeah.
Is there? I don't know.
Well, so that's kind of interesting because most great spiritual leaders often have a period up until they're 30 where they're really kind of trying to find themselves. Augustine was a mess, you know, and living a wild life.
But they're struggling.
Yeah, they're
not
struggling.
giving up. They're struggling.
And usually around 30, there's some kind of moment where you start getting the focus. And so Jesus really, we don't really know much about Jesus after he was born or in the temple when he was 12. There's this whole silent period in Scripture. Now, I just learned that in England, there's some thought that he went to England with Joseph of Arimathea, and as a teenager was in England, which I never knew that. But there are all these traditions. What happened to Jesus when he was a teenager?
Right.
But whatever happened to him, it prepared him for when he was 30, and he saw what his calling was.
Right. My guest is the Reverend Martha McGill of the Emmanuel Episcopal Parish in Cumberland. Let's talk a little bit about the church, because it is a very successful, thriving community. I'm a little bit jealous. I, the rabbi, have a wonderful congregation, but it's smaller. We do a good job, but not to that extent of having so many people involved, musically, spiritually, intellectually. Is it your charisma? What's the, I know you're modest, but you know.
So it really is a struggle now for all mainline denominations, not only in Christianity, but in Judaism around the world. Is Sunday morning is not a priority in the culture as it used to be. Usually we go to town, and if you're Jewish, you find the synagogue. You'd find, if you're Christian, you'd find your church. If you were raised Lutheran, Presbyterian, Baptist.
Right.
And now that's not culture. Culture is not, it's interesting when I'm off on Sunday to see what everybody does. And so if I go out to eat, I'm like, wow, this is where everybody is. Or go to Target, right? Or go to shopping. And it's amazing where people are. So one of the things I think is that the church, there's a theory that the church, every 500 years, whatever the denomination is, there's a big change and shift. And we're in one of those shifting times.
Right.
And I think that the call is to go, you're not hoping people will come in your doors, you're called to go out and bring your message and your welcome out. And so that's what we've tried to do. One of the things I've often done in churches is we've done musicals, we've done theater. And you know, the old medieval cathedrals were some of the places that they had theater. And you kind of are a place where people gather, your community gathering spot, and you want to be open.
Right.
But I think one of the things that is hard is most of your congregation, your faithful congregation, wants Sunday morning to grow. And I don't think that that's a realistic kind of hope right now. I think it's in outreach ministries. One of the really exciting things we're hoping to do in Cumberland is to start a cafe where all can eat. That's a movement all around the country. And it's not like a where you go and it's a feeding ministry where you feed the less fortunate. It's where everyone comes, regardless if they can pay or not, and sits around tables and eats in community, which is, I think, probably what Jesus had in mind.
Right.
So we're working on that with an ecumenical group of folks, and you're part of that.
Thank God.
And also folks who aren't faith-based.
So how can religious tradition speak more effectively to certain serious issues like the drug problem in Cumberland, not only in Cumberland, but other parts of everywhere? People who seem to look for a high through drugs. Is there a way to persuade them that they could find a spiritual high and a way to reduce their pain through spirituality, and helping people to understand the difference between religion, which a lot of people see as, you know, and spirituality, that they can find a deeper connection might dissuade them?
Well, from this mystical, well, they call it the perennial tradition, Richard Rohr does. It's kind of the tradition that's always been in faith communities from the beginning of humanity. The two greatest teachers we have are suffering and love. And so the church and faith-based organizations need to be where the suffering is, where the opioid crisis is, where homelessness is, where great need is. But we also are about loving one another. And right now we're so, and we're also people of the both and, not the either or. And I think that's so needed in our common life right now, because we're all, you're different, you're red, you're blue,
Yeah.
You're Christian, you're Jewish, you're
Yeah.
white, you're black.
Right.
It should be both and.
Right.
One of the things we're going to talk a lot about, well, actually at Emmanuel, we do the reenactment of the running of the Underground Railroad. We are thought in the oral history of the African American community to be a site of the Underground Railroad. So there's a lot of conversation in the community about whether that's true or not. I
We
think
have those tunnels.
yes,
Right? Yeah.
and those are from the French and Indian War. But the belief is that people came up the Potomac, both freed blacks and escaped slaves, and came up through our Watergate that's in the hill, had refuge in the tunnel, and then took the tunnels which run underground to the probably the minister's house, where then they went across the Mason-Dixon line either by carriage or some way, some wagon. So one of the things is I think it's really important that we are there to tell the story, and it's a both and story. It's a story of those who, Emmanuel had members that were slaveholders. We had some that were abolitionists. We had, of course, the whole Underground Railroad piece. We all have to be in the conversation, both and, not either or.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Describe, if you will, the different denominations. I think I asked when Tormund and Rebecca when they were here, if Jesus came back today, you don't have to answer it, but I think it's curious. Where would he find most comfort? Where would he go and say, well, that tradition's sort of speaking what I believe. That one, that's something you can't answer, right? But can you? Can you speak to it?
I think he'd be both and. So if you see him along the road, so the famous parable of the prodigal son. So the father, the son leaves and wants his inheritance so he can go and drink and consort with women and party. And so he went off, and then he spent all his money, was hungry, wanted to come back home. So he comes back home, the father welcomes him. The elder brother is sitting there. I've stayed angry. I've stayed at home. I've been the good child, and
Right.
here you are honoring this profligate son.
Yeah.
Well, Jesus tells that story, and he tells it not only to the disciples in the crowd, but the Pharisees and Sadducees and the scribes are following. So he tells the story to everyone. It's always interesting. The more that I do what I do, I notice that he's speaking to all the different parts of his community, and he has time for all of them.
And Jews too?
Well,
He was
yes,
Jewish? Yeah.
right. But particularly the Pharisees and scribes that are following him. Some of them are trying to trap him, but then you have some of them, like Nicodemus, that come to him at night and want to know more. So he's actually calling the Jewish community back to faithfulness as well as others. But he speaks to those who have fallen off the waves, onto the wayside.
Yeah, yeah.
He speaks to those who are suffering, and he speaks to those in the establishment. He's a both and. So coming back to your denomination piece, I think he would feel comfortable in all of those places. And I think we need to be more comfortable with each other, just as Jesus was.
Yeah. My guest, the Reverend Martha McGill, once again the rector, minister of Emmanuel Episcopal Parish in Cumberland. If you have any questions for her, obviously we're not live. Once you see this, feel free to email me at mjperman and the number 9 at gmail.com. I'll say that slower, mjperman9 at gmail.com. If you have questions or thoughts, I'll pass them on to you.
Sure.
And for a fee, you'll
No.
Thinking about where the church is heading, thinking about where our society is headed, the internet seems to have become sort of the religion for people, and they say that young people don't really join things anymore. We could ask some young people here. They're not joiners. They don't join churches. They don't join, like, used to have fraternities or Masonic lodges or like the Lions Club. So are you seeing a lot of that? Are you getting young people, young families coming in, or is it typically still the older people? How do we reach the younger folks?
Well, so I think where the church is going to be going is it's going to be a smaller, what you call worshiping community that is doing the deep work. one-on-one and in small groups. I think that tends to be a second half of life kind of call. But I do believe that the community outreach activities, the social outreach activities are where the first half of life and second half of life folks want to be. I do see we have a sacred music interns from Frostburg State. We have 4, and we're doing a little class with them about the history of sacred music and what the Episcopal Church is about. And it's fascinating to see the questions they ask. But I think that I think it's going to be more for people who are seeking the spiritual path, are the folks that are going to be on a regular basis in church.
Right. So we have this sort of schism or division. We have it in Judaism. I think you have it, I know you have it in the Christian world too, between the more right-wing, fundamentalist, Bible Belt, I don't know, there's different adjectives, and the more liberal, liberal on abortion, liberal on gay rights, liberal on female clergy. How do you reconcile that? Can you? Is it just 2 different schools of thought and it's never going to come together?
Well, I think it's one of the things we've talked about in the Center for Action and Contemplation is that as humanity, we are working towards a more open and a wider net that we all include each other in. And so one of the things that I think is true about how we make somebody the other is that the essential message that all great faiths have is about love. And Michael Curry, who's the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, he preached at the royal wedding this past summer. And his sermon was right out of this mystical tradition of love and suffering and following that. And he just, for him, that was just such an Episcopal Church kind of sermon. It was about the net is very wide and deep, and it has room for all. It's because there are folks in the Episcopal Church that are fairly conservative theologically, but we also have those who are very progressive, and we're able to stay together. But I mean, of course, there's conflict, but over the years we have stayed together, and I think that's the only hope for faith communities is to do that, not just within their own denomination, but all across the board, and interfaith as well.
There was a friend sent me the article, Rebecca Galler sent me the article about a minister wrote a whole thing in which he contends that you cannot be Christian, and I would extend it to Jewish, if you support some of the beliefs going on today in the administration. You can't be this if you're going to be that. Do you think that's an unfair characterization, that we have to respect all beliefs even if they don't resonate for us, like the abortion issue? I mean, is it an okay religious choice to say, well, I object to gay marriage, therefore I won't do it? Does that make you discriminatory, or that's the way they see their faith and you have to respect it?
Well, I think it's, again, you have to put yourself in a place of both and. There's certain things that I would say for myself that I don't agree with, but I have to see the humanity in the other person. So one of the 2 people that are great models of this for me are Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, because I spent 3 years living in South Africa with my family and shepherding a congregation. And Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu both reached out to the white apartheid leaders who were doing horrific things to their people, and stayed in conversation. And that was probably the only reason I believe that the country didn't fall into civil war. It was because of their ability to walk across a line and be in relationship. How even though they would call, the religious leaders in South Africa regularly call their political leaders to task, but they stay in relationship with them in some way. They see them as a human being. And so Nelson Mandela, the famous piece was that he went to the big Rugby World Cup, and rugby is a huge white Afrikaner sport. It's almost a religion in South Africa. But he went and wore a Springbok jersey and danced with them when they were celebrating, and that just made a huge difference. That he was willing to embrace who they were, but calling them to the truth, and prophetically called them to change some of their ways.
So I don't think we have anybody in that league today, certainly not in this country, but
yes, that's I think that's what we're looking for. I think some people did see that in Obama. I think that was the great hope there, but it's so hard to move a whole country with all of its institutional biases.
Yeah. My guest again, sometimes people tune in and out, so Reverend Martha McGill, the rector of Emmanuel Parish in Cumberland. When people come to your church, can anybody come, and what will they find defines Episcopal versus Lutheran, Presbyterian, Anglican? There is a connection to Anglican, and I read briefly some connection to the Catholic Church, so maybe you can just, in the few minutes we have left, educate people.
So the Episcopal Church was really born when Henry VIII, of many wives, wanted to divorce his first wife because she was not producing, or he wasn't producing. Both of them weren't a male heir to the throne. So and the Pope would not allow divorce, and so he divorced himself in a way from the Pope and what was the universal Christian Church, and became head of the church in England, as well as head of state. But we've kept a lot of the Catholic traditions. So if you come to Emmanuel, it will feel, if you were raised Roman Catholic, the worship will feel very much like the structure of the Catholic Church. But it is different because we have kept a lot of the sacred historic music that the Catholic Church didn't keep after Vatican II. So it will feel, there'll be lots of colors, stained glass, there will be beautiful music, there will be scripture preaching, there'll be communion. But everyone is welcome to the communion table, no matter where you are in your religious walk.
Right.
And it will feel structured, though. It will feel much more structured than Baptist worship or Pentecostal worship. I kind of miss, I used to preach in Baltimore at some of the Black Baptist churches, and I kind of miss getting people to say something back to me like, "You on it," or something. I mean, it's kind of nice to know someone's listening, because most people, it would be quiet for people who grew up in that tradition. It would be much quieter.
So in the minutes we have left, because we're both musically inclined, and Mark Steiner does a great job with the music over there. A lot of time churches now are going to guitar and folk and rock in order to get people in, and the more formal music with the organ and the choir is kind of going out the window. Do you try to balance both worlds?
I have been at churches that have had a 5 p.m. Sunday or Saturday service that's more of a kind of guitar, more folk. But Emmanuel, because of its historic structure and its history, I think that we try to preserve and enhance and educate this wonderful, great tradition of the great English composers, and also all that early music that's monkish plain song chant and Gregorian chant. That it's very spiritual music, and so I think that's kind of our call as a congregation to enhance and educate on that. And I think people can find a really deep, peaceful place in being in that music.
Reverend Martha McGill, friend, colleague.
Thank you,
Mark.
Thank
you so much for joining us, the second episode. Hopefully we'll be back. The Interfaith Roundtable. I'm Rabbi Cantor Mark Perman, chaplain as well. You're a chaplain. We all have to be chaplains.
Yes,
we'll talk about that next time. So any questions, comments, send me an email to mjperman9, mjperman, the number 9 at gmail.com. Thank you, everybody in the studio, and students and faculty. And hopefully we'll see you again on the Interfaith Roundtable.